Hi, how are you? How are you doing, Kinte?
Pretty good, pretty good. I'm very excited to talk to you. We do a show on the TV series Hell on Wheels. And we've had you on talking about that, but this time we get a chance to talk about your books and what you have going on for you. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me here. I was very excited when you called me. This was pretty cool. I was like, ooh, books to movies. Wait a minute. Mine haven't been made into movies yet, but maybe one day.
hey, you never know, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You never know. So I think, like I said, the way that we always love to do it when we do our interviews is to get an idea about your background. So please tell us where you're from originally.
Well, I live in Kansas City. I originally actually grew up in Florida, but I've been out here for 30 years or so. So I'm pretty much a transplanted Midwesterner, and I've been full-time writing, for probably about 7 years, and I love books, obviously, love movies. I write historical romance set in the American West because I'm a huge fan of Western, all things Western. What else would you like to know?
Why Western?
Why Western? I grew up watching Westerns. I think I remember, sitting in the living room with my grandfather and my father, and we were watching, all the old Westerns and John Wayne. And I don't know. I loved all those old Western shows and the TV shows and the movies. And I guess I was just kind of fascinated by it. I also love American history, and I remember when I started writing, somebody said, write what you know, and I had been doing a lot of research in this area at the time, and I thought, not a lot of people know much about the history of this area in the Midwest, and that would be really fun to write about. And I'm charged up about it. Maybe somebody else will be charged up about it if I put it in a book. So I weave a lot of real history into my books because I am such a history geek.
A history geek. I love it. So what's different about writing love stories set in the West than maybe modern stories? What's the rule of thumb?
What's different about it? Well, I would say in the past there are a lot of things that can get in the way. I mean, just the way of life was a lot more difficult. And there were a lot more challenges in terms of, there are no phones, and, you just can't hop in the car. There's a lot, the technology's not there. So those are some, kind of physical challenges that you face. And I don't know. I think I was born 150 years too late. I kind of have a love for the past, and I could do the Outlander thing any day, especially if I landed in bed with some guy that looked like Jamie.
So you would do like Back to the Future, just go back to the Old West, huh?
There you go.
And just bury the DeLorean and just live out your days there, huh?
Yeah. Long as I could come back.
Now I can imagine that while you do these books, that you do a lot of research. So during the research process, is it a fun process, or is it boring, or what's the research process like?
Well, I'm a history geek, so I always have to say that because I love research. I love reading about history. I love doing the research. I love finding obscure little things that people might not know about that I can kind of put in my books. I tend to drive my family crazy because I talk about history a lot when I find some really cool fact or something. In fact, the series that I wrote, it really kind of got started when I stumbled across this little brochure in a museum about a railroad race. And it was just so interesting, and I thought, well, that'd really make a cool story. I started looking for information, and I couldn't find anything. It was very difficult to find anything. So I finally got online, and I started looking in the library, and I found something. I ordered it through the library. It was a master's thesis thesis of a doctor who had, done it as a master's thesis. It was down at Wichita State, and they actually sent me the guy's master's thesis to look at and to review. I was blown away, but it ended up being really the basis for the book Her Bodyguard, and all of the lots and lots of the facts in that book are real facts that actually happened, and it was great. It just gave me a perfect plot. So I love the process. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
As an author myself, I always love to know, because you just spoke a lot about your research and how fun that is. What is your writing process like? Is there any particular time frame that you like to write? During the day, do you prefer to write in the evening?
Yeah, I work best in the morning. My mind works best when I'm fresh and up early. By the time I would say 3 o'clock rolls around, I'm pretty much done by then. As far as really being able to crank out a lot of good words, I can still edit and things like that. But I'm best in the morning, and my writing process is pretty back and forth. I'm what people call a pantser, which means right by the seat of your pants.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I do the same thing, and people laugh at me. That there's plotters and there's pantsers. So especially because if you're doing westerns, kudos to you for that, because of the amount of research. Wow.
Well, I'm a pantser who longs to be a plotter. So I do attempt to lay out what I call turning points, big turning points in the story, and then I just write towards them. And I find that a lot of times the story that I conceive, I'll think that I know what's going to happen, but then I start writing it, and all of a sudden everything changes. But that's what makes it so much fun to write. So I surprise myself.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Since you're a big history buff, who is your favorite history figure?
Oh, my favorite historical figure. Wow. That's really tough. I have a lot of them.
Okay, top three. How about top three? We'll do top three.
Oh, gosh. I'd really admire Abraham Lincoln. And I would never write a book about him. There's lots of books out there about him, but I admire him greatly. I love Mark Twain. He's a historical figure. He's also an author, and he's my muse. So I love anything he wrote. I just admire him. I love his humor. I love the way he was able to really capture America and really the identity and the personality of the country at the time. Oh, who else is my favorite historical person? I love John Adams. I got all fascinated by him when I read the book John Adams. He was really an interesting character. I think he's kind of he's overlooked a lot, but he was a fascinating person. And Benjamin Franklin. I don't know. I could kind of go on and on, but those are just some that come to mind right off the top of my head.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now let's talk about one of your books, Her Bodyguard. Just kind of give us the rundown on the synopsis and where the idea came from.
Well, interestingly enough, Her Bodyguard was the first railroad book I wrote. And like I said, the idea actually came from that little brochure that I found in a museum about a railroad race. And I began to read about it and realized it would make a great story. So that's kind of where the idea came from. But what was really interesting was I was working on that book, and about the time I was finished with that book, Hell on Wheels started. And I was just sitting there staring at the TV going, oh my gosh, this is kind of just like my story that I just wrote. This is so awesome. And the more I watched it, the more excited I got, and I thought, wow, this would make a great series. This whole railroad idea, what they've done with it on television, I could do that with books. And so that's kind of how the whole idea for the series came up, was really watching the TV show. But Her Bodyguard is really about a wealthy railroad investor who's a woman, and she hires a drifter to protect her, hires him as her bodyguard, and not really knowing his background, and she finds out that she ends up finding out that he kind of poses the biggest threat of all, because he's actually working behind the scenes against her. But it's a love story, so they fall in love and they work out their differences. But there's suspense in the story. There's someone out to kill her, and they don't know who it is. And he's trying to work against her, but at the same time, he's trying to protect her. So it creates a conflict for him. And the main character of that book is probably most like the character of Cullen Bohannon on Hell on Wheels. He's an ex-Confederate. He's got a lot of baggage. And I would just say he's probably most like that character.
Are you anticipating any more in the series with this? Or is this just a standalone book? Or
No, there are actually 3 books in the series. There's a book called Passion's Prize, which is actually a novel in 3 parts that I wrote with 2 other authors, Jennifer Jakes and Jackie Nelson. And that actually is sort of done in a style of taking 3 stories of 3 different couples, and there is a plot that sort of weaves through all 3. So they're all tied together by a plot of the railroad race that I wrote about. And so each of these 3 stories is separate stories, but there's characters that are shared, and the plot goes through all 3. And the race that I wrote about is actually a race that went through southeast Kansas in the 1870s, and there's a lot of similarities with what happened in that race that a lot of people don't know about, and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was really a race in and of itself between 2 railroads kind of coming at each other. This happened to be a race of 2 railroads. They were all actually 3 to begin with, but 2 ended up. 2 railroads who were racing to reach Indian Territory, Oklahoma, Indian Territory at the time. And whoever got there first got to go through the territory and into Texas and get cattle country. So it was an intensive, cutthroat race, and there was a lot of dirty tricks played. And so Passion's Prize sort of follows that race and introduces you to lots of different characters, who are part of that race and that story. Her Bodyguard tells you the story from a different railroad. So Passion's Prize follows the Katy Railroad. Her Bodyguard follows the Border Tier Railroad. And then my latest book, A Dangerous Passion, picks up where Passion's Prize left off and tells the story of the Katy Railroad after it won the race, but it was far from being, a finished deal. So there are 3 books in the series, and I'm working on a 4th one now.
Now, when you write romance novels, one thing you can expect is some steaminess. So, in your books, what's the steam meter set to?
That's what's so interesting. I will say something like, they're not that bad. They're just kind of spicy. And other people read them and go, oh my gosh, these things are really steamy. So that is totally, a subjective call. I call them a little spicy. Yes, there are love scenes in them, and they get pretty specific, but it's not erotica. I don't know how else to. I don't know how else to describe it. It's steamy, but not too steamy.
So it would be on. Would it be on Cinemax before 8 or after 8 if there was a movie version?
No, it would have to be after 8. You could.
Good to know. Now, when you write, do you write for a? I know romance novels are slated towards women, but do you think males would, appreciate your writing as well? Yeah,
I think so, because I think there's enough. Unless this is like assuming guys don't get into love stories, which I think they do, actually. I think that's wrong to assume they don't. Mm-hmm. But let's just say the romance part of it isn't all that attractive. There's a lot of history in the books too, and the book tells a bigger story too. So I think guys could find them interesting. I would hope so anyway. There's some men who've read the book who responded to me and said they really enjoyed it. So
now also too. As we, evolve in whatever talent that we have, you're a terrific writer. What have you learned? Like, what do you try to learn with each process of writing a book? I mean, how do you evolve, or how do you set yourself up to so that you're able to evolve with each book?
I would say that with each book, I strive to get better. With each book, I strive to write better. I focus on storytelling and try to become a better storyteller with every book. It'd be great to think that, the best book in the world was my first book, but no, it's not. I would prefer the best book in the world not to be my first book. I would prefer it to be the next book and the next book, and they just keep getting better and better. And that's what I strive for.
I have a question. Since you write so much, what do you like to read? Like, what kind of books do you sit down to read on a Sunday afternoon?
Oh, wow. I read romance, a lot of it. I read lots of different types of romance. I read a lot in my own genre of historical romance. I read contemporary romance. I read paranormal. I read a lot of different romance. I read historical fiction. I like historical fiction a lot. I read biographies. I read nonfiction.
I love biographies.
Yeah, I read biographies. I read nonfiction. Those are probably my top things to pick and pull down. I even read I'll go back and read literature, I haven't read, this book in a while. I'll go back and pick it up and read it. Just because I think it's just a good exercise to read how people put words together, and it'll always inspire me, so.
Yeah, you find your best inspiration through other people sometimes.
Yeah.
Have you ever, was working on something and then you read another book and you're like, dang, that's too close to what I was going to do, and maybe abandon it, or do you adjust it or something like that? Did that ever happen?
I haven't ever had that happen to me where I read something and I thought, I can't write it because somebody's doing that. I did have to laugh about, when I began to work on this series and Hell on Wheels came around, someone said, did you just take that idea and write it? And I said, no, actually I didn't. I was writing the series about the time the show started. It inspired me to actually make a ongoing series out of my idea versus just a single book. But I said, if you look at the history of railroads, very similar stories. You had the same characters in a lot of cases. So, I didn't think that it was bad that there were some similarities. Actually, I thought it was kind of interesting and good. And I enjoyed being able to sort of tell my own tale of it. Pick up characters and say, I love the character, for instance, of Durant in the show of Hell on Wheels. And when I found a similar character in history by the name of Robert Stevens, I thought I have got to use him as kind of the basis for my character in this book, A Dangerous Passion. I just think he's so fascinating. He's Durant-like, but he's sort of a kinder, gentler Durant. Mm-hmm. He ends up being a nicer guy. But he's got a lot of the same characteristics early on. So sometimes I get inspired by things like that, and then I take and sort of give it my own twist.
And for those who are maybe not familiar with the character Durant, you might want to give them a little background on who he is.
Oh, yeah. In Hell on Wheels, he's kind of the railroad boss, if you will. He's the guy who's the head of the Union Pacific Railroad, and he's what everybody thinks of as the railroad baron, he's always got tricks up his sleeve. He's all about power and ambition, and being wealthy and having power and owning that railroad, and that's what he's all about. And he'll do anything to succeed. And I thought that kind of a character would be fascinating to write about, and then throw that guy into a situation where he falls in love. And now what is he going to do? You got the ambition and the passion, and they're colliding, and what happens? And that's what A Dangerous Passion is about.
Wow. I have another question. Speaking of what types of things you like to read on a Sunday, who are some of your go-to writers when you're just reading? Do you have any favorite authors that you like?
I do, and it's terrible for me to I always feel bad listing them, because I know so many people and I have so many favorites.
I know.
But I would say that, like I said, I know this sounds silly, but Mark Twain is one of my favorite authors, and I go to his books a lot because of just the way he described America, and just the way he, I just love his humor. As far as contemporary authors, I was real influenced by, Julie Garwood was one of the first ones that when I was reading romance, I thought, man, she's amazing, and I want to write like her. I love Jill Marie Landis. She's been very influential for me. She writes beautiful American historical romance, and she's been very influential in my writing and actually in my life. She's an amazing person. I love Kristen Hanna's work. Diana Gabaldon. I mean, gosh, Outlander. Wow. I could just read that book over and over again. Those are a few.
Is there any other genre besides historical romance? If you had to pick anything else to write about, what other genre would you write about?
I would probably do fantasy.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. Like supernatural fantasy type, not your typical paranormal, but more of on the fantasy side. I like fairy tales, so I like fantasy. I like, I enjoy reading horror sometimes, but I loved it a whole lot better when I was younger. And as I got older, I got to where I just, didn't read as much of it. I don't know why. It seems very strange. My daughter's way into it. I introduced her to Stephen King, and she can't stop. She can't stop reading it. And of course, Stephen King's amazing and wonderful, and I read. I've been reading his books for years. And he is, he's psychological. His psychological, he really writes those psychological thrillers. Is the way I kind of look at his books. They're so. Yeah, and Dean Koontz, yes. Somebody just wrote Dean Koontz, yes, absolutely. Thumbs up.